Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP, and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Colonna, and this is Nashville. African Americans have contributed in countless ways to the history of Nashville and Tennessee. Some contributions are well known, like the lunch counter sit-ins and school desegregation. Others have been lost to history. Today, we're going to hear from those who work to preserve this history. Now, in 1981, a group of Nashville historians proposed an all-day conference to focus on the contributions of local African Americans to culture and history. Now, in its 44th year, the Nashville Conference on African American History and Culture brings together academics, historians, performers, and artists to present on a wide range of people and topics. Joining us now to talk about the conference and its origins is historian and conference co-founder and friend of the show, Linda Wynn. Welcome back, Linda. It's good to see you.
Good to be back.
Okay, so I do want to talk about the conference a little bit, but before we do, we're in the middle of Black History Month, and I just want to go back to something that you're very familiar with. When you were teaching, you would tell your students that African American history is American history. Why did you feel the need to say that to them, particularly to say that out loud to them?
Because I think students and people in general think that African American history is somehow set apart, and it is not a part of American history. You cannot have American history without African American. You cannot have African American without American history. Mm-hmm. The way I explain it is, if I look at American history, I see that as the subject. African American history is the topic, especially if you're doing like a survey course. If I was doing a specific area in African American history, then African American history becomes the subject, and the topic may be the civil rights movement in Nashville, or the topic may be Black women and the desegregation of transportation entities. So it's African American is merely a topic within American history. You can't have one without the other.
And, and regarding Nashville specifically, being here hosting this show for 3 years, I've learned through being the host of this show that Nashville's history is important to American history.
Absolutely. If I look at, say, the Civil Rights Movement, for example, and that cadre of students who were here from Fisk University, Tennessee State, American Baptist, and Meharry, after they finished with the sit-ins here and went to the Freedom Rides, they spanned out across the South, trying to advance civil rights. And what I have found is Nashville plays a major part in the civil rights movement, those students that left here. But I often describe it, at best, the Nashville story and the students, with the exception of a few like John Lewis or maybe Diane Nash, is basically a footnote at best and an endnote at worst, because there has not been a definitive history written on the Nashville movement. You get bits and pieces of it.
Yeah.
You find it referenced in other stories about the Nashville movement, but it's generally like a footnote or maybe a paragraph or two. If you do a timeline of the state of Tennessee and the nation, in many instances you find that African Americans in Nashville or in Tennessee were really doing things before it captured the national attention. Mm-hmm. But that's not known because there is not that general history of say, the civil rights movement in Tennessee.
When I think about that, I'm thinking about the entirety of American history. And I'm just recalling when I was in school, in high school, in middle school, learning a little bit about, they were, like you said, it was a kind of a footnote. There was a mention to the sit-ins that happened here that the students 60 years ago took part in. And I'm thinking about all of American history, the ugly parts and the pretty parts. A lot of times we learn mostly only about the pretty parts of our history. So, tell us, why is it important for us to learn, the wonderful things that have happened in this country and the not so savory things that have happened here?
It's important to learn those things because America is still an experiment in process where we actually do not live up to the enunciations in the documents, the founding documents of the country. Mm-hmm. It's aspirational. We're trying to get to be that more perfect union. We're trying to be, and I'm going to use a word that people don't like these days, more inclusive, mm-hmm. bringing everybody into that more perfect union as opposed to trying to separate. And we see that separation is very prevalent today. We want to remove African American history from the books, take them out of the schools. We want to remove women's history, take that out of the schools, and other histories that deal with particular groups. So it's aspirational. We make strides, then we fall back, and we make strides again. It's something that humans are frail, at best. And we're in, I think, one of those points right now where America is experiencing one of those frail points by not wanting to be inclusive. And I think the lesson that should be learned from inclusivity is that we all benefit. Mm-hmm. If you don't have certain groups included, just look at the brain power that you are excluding. Look at the contributions that could and should be made because you are excluding a group of people. If you go and look at, say, some of the new inventions, look at what African Americans have contributed. Even when you talk about the sciences or computer science, look at those contributions that African Americans have made. If you're talking about being in the armed services, look at the contributions that African Americans made. Look at the Tuskegee Airmen. I think we just lost the last living Tuskegee Airman sometimes near the end of the month or the beginning of this month. Mm-hmm. Look at those contributions. Where would America be without the brain power of all of its people?
Mm. I mentioned earlier the Nashville Conference on African American History and Culture is now in its 44th year. Congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. In many ways, it's bittersweet for me personally because I am the only living member of the founding group. So, I always think about Dr. Bobby Lovett, Maydeen Eberling, and Lois McDougall, who was a professor at Tennessee State, and, of course, Dr. Revis Mitchell. So it's sort of bittersweet for me in many ways, but at least I've been able to carry on what we started 44 years ago.
How did you all start that?
It started basically because there were a lot of projects going on in Nashville that were concerned with African American history, and we felt like nobody knew what each other was doing. Mm-hmm. So we came up with the idea, well, let's have a one-day conference and bring all of these people in and let them talk about what they're doing so others would be informed and not repeat what was being done. So that was the genesis of it.
Continue, I'm sorry.
We did not realize, We started in September of 81. And the next year we said, well, last year went pretty good. Maybe we'll try it again. And so we moved it to February the following year. And that was successful, and we just kept going. After Dr. Lovett left, the chair, Dr. Revis Mitchell, and I became co-chairs. And we just continued throughout the years.
How has it changed over the years?
It has changed. We bring in more scholars now who have done work on various aspects of African American history in Nashville. We're not exclusive to Nashville. We have had people come in and talk about what may be happening in Knoxville or Fayette County or Memphis or some other places. But the primary focus is Nashville. We have more students attending now than we did when we originally started out. And those students include not only college students, but high school students. So that has been a change. We look more so at culture. That has been introduced into it. So that, there have been some changes, but the basic premise has always remained the same.
I do want you to tell us a little bit about this year's conference, but I want to ask, given what we started with, and you saying that, there's an erasure of history, attempt to erase African American history, are you anticipating more students to attend and to have a thirst for this knowledge that's being kept from them?
In order to get to that, you have to get to the teachers on the high school level. You have to get to the professors on the collegiate level. And we, with Dr. Williams being at Tennessee State, that's one aspect that he works on. We reach out to metropolitan public schools with the secondary level. I am hoping that as it continues, that more students will come in to the conference. I also have some fears, depending on what legislation may emanate from various levels of government. So I really think that it's incumbent upon all of us, especially parents and churches. And just to give a little side story, my interest in history began in church. The ladies at my church, there was an organization, the Ladies Aid Society, and they used to have a tea and they would bring in people. And a lot of those people would talk about African Americans in history, and at that time they were called Negro. So you learned about Paul Laurence Dunbar, or you learned about W.B. Du Bois, or you learned about various people. You learned about the origins of Fisk University or Tennessee State or Preston Taylor or J.C. Napier. So that's where my interest in history began. And I think it's going to be, if we go where I think we may go, I think it's going to be incumbent upon those institutions within the African American community to focus on the history of African Americans. And when you think about African American history, most of it is acts of resilience. You look at the sit-ins, those students, who sat in Nashville on February the 13th. What are they looking for? It's equality, but you think about the travail that they went through. That's an act of resilience, to come out on the other side with a win. And you see those acts of resilience throughout African American history.
Now, one of the speakers at this year's conference is Tammy Gordon from the Greenwood Seneca Foundation, which approaches to visit historic sites through the lens of African Americans. What kind of sites will she be talking about at the conference this year?
She specifically worked with Travelers Rest early on. And what she's looking at is that African American experience when you go to a historic site. Historic sites they don't know exactly how to deal with that African American experience. Mm-hmm. I'll cite an example. Many, many years ago, I was on a committee with the Hermitage, and they wanted to call the enslaved servants. And I thought, that's not right.
Yeah.
My people were not servants. To me, servants imply that you may have received some compensation. Call them what they were. They were enslaved by Andrew Jackson. So they grapple with how do you tell that story, and the Hermitage's concern was being offensive to African Americans who may have visited. Mm-hmm. So I get that, but to me it was offensive not to say what my people actually were.
Yeah.
Now everybody may not have that mindset, but that was my mindset at the time. It is my mindset now. Tell the true experience of African Americans at these historic sites. And so that's what she's going to be basically talking about.
I understand what you're saying, because in order to fully understand the truth of something, we've got to get all of the information and facts. And yes, a lot of our history, as I stated earlier, a lot of our history is ugly. A lot of our history is difficult to deal with and grapple, but how can we grow if we don't face that? If we have to do it for our own individual selves and personal lives, at the very least, we can do that collectively as a community. Now, I also understand there's performances at this conference as well, right?
Yes, we will have a group from Tennessee State that's directed by Dr. Michelle Pinkert, the Soul Fire. They're going to do spoken word on poetry, Black history, voting, love. So I'm looking forward to that performance just to see what they come up with.
We got to go to break pretty soon, but where can people find out more so they can learn some of this history and attend for themselves?
The conference has a website under the Metro Historical Commission. If you go to the Metro Historical Commission's website, you will find a link to the website for the Nashville Conference on African American History and Culture. The conference will be held this Friday, starting at 8:30. That's when registration opens. It will go from 9 till about 3:30, and the registration fee at this point will be $35.
Okay. Linda Wynn, you're going to stick with us through the break, okay?
Thank you.
All right. Linda Wynn is the founder of the Nashville Conference on African American History and Culture, now in its 44th year. All right. We're going to take that break. When we come back, Dr. Edward Robinson joins us to talk about the life and legacy of a prominent Black Nashvilleian from the earliest 20th century, Preston Taylor. Stay with us. This is Nashville.
Funding for This is Nashville comes from Burr & Foreman Law Firm, serving clients with transactional, litigation, and regulatory needs. Discovering how each client defines a win and working with them every step of the way to achieve it. Burr.com.
I'm Khalil Ekulona, and this is Nashville. Now, if you live in Nashville, the name Preston Taylor easily rolls off the tongue. Just think historic Preston Taylor Apartments, Preston Taylor Ministries, or Preston Taylor Boys and Girls Club. But who was this prominent African-American businessman and religious leader? And what impact did he have on Nashville that makes us want to still honor him almost 100 years later? Joining us now is Dr. Edward Robinson, author of To Pave the Way for His People, A Life of Preston Taylor. Also still with us is Linda Wynn, co-founder of the Nashville Conference on African American History and Culture, now in its 44th year. Dr. Robinson, really appreciate you being here. Welcome to This is Nashville.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm so pleased to be with you this afternoon.
I'm really pleased to be with you and to learn about Preston Taylor. Tell us where and when was Preston Taylor born?
Preston Taylor was born in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1849. And so he was definitely an enslaved person, and he is quite a fascinating and very significant person as well.
I want to learn a little bit about his early life. Do we know what his family was like?
Well, it's somewhat very kind of muddy, if you will, or his background is somewhat obscure. We do have bits and pieces. So we do know that his mother was an enslaved person, and he was connected to the family of Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor is our 12th president, and so in the antebellum period, you had a lot of racial and sexual mixing that went on, and so his father was a white man, and his mother Betty was an enslaved woman, a black woman, and so his father's identity is still it remains nebulous, not really sure, but we do know that he was born in 1849. And so here we are, that's just before the decade of polarization, that is the 1850s, where you have all of the tumult and turbulence that's going on throughout the country. And we are a decade from the Civil War. So it was a very chaotic and tumultuous time that he was born in and grew up in. He was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, but the Taylor family relocated to Kentucky, and that's where he's going to actually grow up.
What was his education like?
Yeah, regarding his education, Preston Taylor, as best we know, did not have like formal education, in that he attended an organized school or college, but in that he ended up at Camp Nelson. He was exposed to white teachers who had come from the North, and he was able to get education being a part of the Union Army. And so he was mostly what you call an autodidact, and that he was self-taught. Of course, he got help from teachers who came from the North, but he was mostly self-taught. But he had a thirst for knowledge even beyond his adolescent and teen years, and that's going to be one of the reasons why education is going to be a driving force for Preston Taylor.
Well, how did he make his way to Nashville?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, now keep in mind that Preston Taylor was affiliated with what's known as the Stone Campbell movement. That's a religious movement that it has basically three branches, to make it really simple. Stone Campbell, that's Barton W. Stone, who was a white leader in Kentucky, and Alexander Campbell, another white leader. They joined forces basically around 1832, and so they become one movement, but it's going to splinter off into the left wing group, the Disciples of Christ, what we call today the middle group, the independent Christian churches, and then the right wing group would be the Churches of Christ. And so Preston Taylor was aligned with the Disciples of Christ, and so he was preaching there. He was preaching there in Kentucky, but he had contacts with people in Middle Tennessee, and so he made the decision around 1885 to leave Kentucky. Now, and I believe there were perhaps some personal factors. He went through a divorce. He had a child uh, who died, and then he was trying to launch a school, and that school eventually collapsed. And so he starts his life over again and makes his way to Nashville, Tennessee around 1885. And there he's going to become the minister for what was the Gay Street Church of Christ. And then there's going to be some trouble there, and he's going to be ousted, and he will launch the Leah Avenue Christian Church, which is now the New Covenant Christian Church there in Nashville, Tennessee.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Kulona. We're talking about the life and legacy of Preston Taylor, an influential Nashvilleian you may or may not have heard of. My guests are Dr. Edward Robinson and Linda Wynn. So Dr. Robinson, you mentioned a few of his achievements and contributions to Nashville, but I'm interested in understanding how these contributions impacted business here in Nashville.
Oh, yes, most definitely. Man, we have to care about Preston Taylor. His life matters, of course, for Nashville, Middle Tennessee, but even beyond. Well, consider, for example, the Greenwood Cemetery that Preston Taylor organized going back to 1888. Okay, and that represents his desire to bestow dignity on Black people, on Black bodies. Okay, keep in mind this is during the time of segregation, when Blacks were not even allowed to be buried in white cemeteries. And of course, this is going to benefit Black people specifically, but also the economy there in Nashville as well. And then economically, in terms of his launching, and of course he had help. He didn't do it alone. The 1 cent Savings Bank and Trust, which he launched along with J.C. Napier and R.H. Boyd. They joined forces and launched that bank, and it's still, I understand that's the oldest continuous Black-owned bank in the United States. I mean, you can imagine the economic impact that bank has had and is still having in Middle Tennessee. And then, of course, don't forget Preston Taylor, along with James C. Napier and R.H. Boyd and others, launched what is now, of course, Tennessee State University. And so, I mean, you can imagine, again, the people who have been trained there, who've gone on to accomplish great things and have given back not just to Middle Tennessee, but to our nation and then even globally. And so I contend that Preston Taylor's importance and influence is far-reaching, far-reaching indeed.
Linda, how did his influence really impact Black society here in Nashville? What was it like when you were younger and learned about him?
Let me give full disclosure. I knew about Preston Taylor, but I didn't know a lot about him. When I was younger, I mean, it really didn't faze me one way or the other. Mm-hmm. It was when I became a historian. It was mentioned that he founded Greenwood Cemetery, but I also think it's very important to understand that he founded Greenwood Park in about 1905, which preceded Hadley Park, which was the first public park in the South for African Americans. So Greenwood Park was extremely important in terms of recreational facilities for African Americans, and African Americans enjoyed going to that park. I mean, it had all of the amenities that one would even think about. Merry-go-rounds, the whole 9 yards. And African Americans saw that as a way to be able to have recreation and be out from under the views of whites. It was some place where they could go recreate and be be free. But Preston Taylor is extremely important to Nashville. Without him and others, J.C. Napier, R.H. Board, would you have the Citizens Savings Bank and Trust Company?
Look, I bank there, so
Okay.
yeah.
Probably not. Dr. Boyd's, R.H. Boyd's, I can't remember if it's the great-granddaughter, is head of the bank today. So it has stayed in the Boyd family for all of its long existence. Other aspects of Preston Taylor, 1905 streetcar boycott. He was involved with that along with others. They even formed a streetcar company to go along with that boycott. And that boycott, which occurred in 1905, was among one of 27 or 28 boycotts that took place across the nation between 1903 and 1907. They formed the Union Transportation Company, which was ultimately sabotaged by, and they were electric cars. It was sabotaged by the city. When they would take the cars to be charged, they would overcharge them. So Preston Taylor is extremely important in African American history.
You know, as I mentioned, Nashville has a few organizations today that really bear his name. And Dr. Robinson, you are presenting your work on Preston Taylor at the Nashville Conference on African American History and Culture. Tell us this. Why is it important to you to keep his memory alive?
That's a very good question. And it's so important that we keep his memory alive because some of the challenges that African Americans faced in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we're still grappling with some of those issues today. Getting access, for example, to capital, ensuring that our people are treated with dignity in life and in death. It's so important, and I'm hoping that that our people will be inspired, and not just our people, but just people in general will be inspired by his amazing life. That he was a man who was born into chattel enslavement, yet emerged and became one of the most prominent Black people in the country. In fact, I maintain that in many ways, Preston Taylor belongs in the same pantheon, if you will, as a Frederick Douglass, as even in many ways a Martin Luther King Jr. When you consider what Professor Wynn just mentioned about the boycott, the transportation boycott, 1905, Martin Luther King Jr. is not born until 1929. And so, I mean, there's already been some Black people agitating for civil rights long before the arrival of Martin Luther King Jr. and many others. And so, yes, and I like to think of it this way: that you have Frederick Douglass, so from 1845 until his death in 1895, Frederick Douglass is without question the most prominent Black man in the United States. And so in 1895, Booker T. Washington picks up the torch of leadership. And so for a 2-decade period from 1895 to 1915, Booker T. Washington dies in 1915. He is the prominent leader, but check this out. Booker T. Washington included a story on Preston Taylor in his book, The Negro in Business, which he published in 1906. So he's highlighting in that book the prominent entrepreneurs among African Americans in the country. And Preston Taylor, his story is included in that text. So that tells you something about the stature of this man. And I'm just hoping that we can be not only inspired by him, but be even motivated to step out and stand up and do great things, even in this 21st century.
Khalil, if I may, there is a historical marker for Preston Taylor. It is placed at the site of the former Preston Taylor homes. So he is on the public landscape, especially in that area. But I wrote a book on historical markers, and I certainly go through the marker for Preston Taylor and Preston Taylor's importance.
I want to thank my guest for this history lesson and this conversation. Dr. Edward Robinson is the author of To Pave the Way for His People, A Life of Preston Taylor. And Linda Wynn is the co-founder of the Nashville Conference on African American History and Culture, now in its 44th year. Thank you both so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take one last break. When we come back, we're going to talk with board members from the Nashville City Cemetery Association. They're going to talk about the legacy of African Americans who are buried there. Stay with us. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil A. Kulona, and this is Nashville. Last Saturday, the Nashville City Cemetery Association honored the 6,000 Black people, both enslaved and free, who are buried there. The focus of the ceremony was the nearly 3,000 unnamed, those buried without a name entered into the formal record. Joining us now are Nashville City Cemetery Association board members Natalie Bell and Betsy Thorpe. I'd like to welcome you both to This is Nashville. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Okay, so Betsy, the Nashville City Cemetery was established in 1822 by the city of Nashville. At the time, what were the requirements to be buried there?
You had to die in Nashville.
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay, so anyone.
I don't mean to be flip, but
No, I'm with you.
it was anybody, if you were visiting from out of town or...
Okay.
Yeah.
You did not have to be a resident, anyone.
Correct.
So the cemetery was integrated, but within the gates, how was it segregated?
We don't know for sure, but it doesn't seem like in the beginning there was a segregation. People were just buried wherever they bought a plot or wherever someone purchased a plot for them. It's as time went by, it seems like there is a concentration area where there are primarily African Americans buried there, but there are also people who aren't. So I don't think it was a hard and fast segregation within the cemetery.
Okay, now last weekend you produced a public program and ceremony at the cemetery called More Than a Name to honor the 6,000 African Americans buried in the city cemetery, and especially, as I mentioned before, the 3,000 who were buried without a name in the formal record. What can you tell us about the 3,000 folks? Who were they? Why were they buried there without identification?
Well, most of them were children of the unnamed, the people that were buried without their names being recorded. So they were identified in that they were identified either by their relationship to a parent who was free. So it would say like free, child of color, child of Khalil, or it would say the one that would be really disturbing, like you'd see like infant, slave of whoever. And so they were either identified by the person who enslaved them or by their free parent. But their particular name was not entered into the record. And I talked to Brian Gilley, the city cemetery manager, and he indicated to me that he felt that that was just a choice that the person doing the records made, that they just chose. It was easier than like getting the name was just to write child or infant, and that was just their choice. But he doesn't know for sure, but that's what he felt.
Looking at the names, the way they're named or unnamed, and some of these titles, let's say, that they have that you just described. It paints a picture of like the grim realities that Nashvillians were facing back then.
Yes. But I will say this, the fact that someone was buried without their name being recorded doesn't really mean a whole lot about how they were viewed by the people who loved them. Because the grave sites that we met at where we did was it was primarily an African-American family. The father was white, and the children and their mother were African-Americans. But they lived as man and wife for like 30 years, so. But they were all buried, and these children that are listed in that record as infants, there's 5 of them. Infants, slave of John Bosley, but they were actually his beloved children who have beautiful headstones and are buried next to him and the woman that he lived with for 30 years. So, like the records don't always indicate like what, when you first look at it, it isn't always what you think.
Not the entire story.
Right. It is not and there's an entire story under every one of those grave markers.
Now, for our producer, Mary Mancini, went to More Than a Name program last weekend. We're going to take a listen to some of what she captured.
Our program today will highlight those people who are buried here without a name.
America did something to us. I don't know. It was something like that was not done in the whole world. And that was to strip us of our name, to strip us of really our humanity. So it's to our credit to pay deference to people who endured such hardship, such pain of being recognized not as human. So yes, we're doing a great thing here today.
This is sacred, holy ground. And as we remember them, and then we understand that we're standing on the shoulders of giants, what this means for us today is that we must continue on in the work that we do in our community. Here lie John B. and Alice Bosley, along with their children. 2-year-old John Bosley died 1845. 7-year-old twins Mary Jane and Samuel Bentley Bosley died February 1837. 7-month-old John Bosley died July 1847.
Sounds like a really special moment. Natalie, tell me, why do you feel it's important to have this formal ceremony?
Well, it's to recognize that there was an African-American presence in Nashville from its very beginning. And many of the African-Americans who lived during that time, as we said, 6,000 graves, are buried in that Nashville City Cemetery. It's the oldest public cemetery in the city. And when Nashville was founded around 1890 with the first settlers, the James Robertsons, there were 20% of that delegation of people who came with the Robertsons, the Donaldsons, and so forth. 20% of those people were African American, and some were free, some were slaves. And the African American population in Nashville grew and expanded over the next 80 years up through the Civil War. After the Civil War broke out, it really expanded.
Now, I understand that the association just placed a marker on the grave of Abraham McGavick, who had been enslaved by the McGavick family in Williamson County. He was sold to James McGavick at age 5. Tell us this, Natalie. Who was he and how did he end up buried at the Nashville City Cemetery?
Well, he was enslaved in Williamson County. And as I mentioned earlier, after the Civil War broke out, there were thousands of African Americans who flocked to Nashville with Union occupation being in place. The Union had come in and taken over Nashville, and these were African Americans who were fleeing to Union lines, hoping that they might be free or get their freedom. This wasn't unclear. This was not clear at the time, but there were thousands who came not only from the Nashville region, Middle Tennessee region, but from all over the country. And this is something that's been documented with researchers who we're working with.
Mm-hmm. How was his grave located?
So, first off, he was a named person in the records of the cemetery. Abraham McGavick. He was born in 1842 in Williamson County to parents who were also enslaved, of course, in Williamson County. When the Union took over Nashville, came in through Kentucky and got control of the Cumberland River, like I said, African Americans came from everywhere, and so it's understood that people just walked off plantations and came to Nashville. And his mother is documented as having said that she walked off and came to Nashville. She was able to walk away from her enslaver and come to Nashville. Her son, Abraham McGavick, lived not far away, and the next time we identify him in records, he's working on the forts. There were 5 forts in addition to Fort Negley. Fort Negley was the main fort, and then there were 4 other forts. And the Union Army conscripted African Americans to build those forts. And he was one of the laborers on the forts. And then later, after 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, he joins the USCT, the United States Colored Troops. Mm-hmm. And his story mostly was found and researched in the pension records. He was wounded. He fought in the Battle of Nashville, and he was wounded so that he eventually died from that wound. And he died in 1867. His mother filed for a pension to get the pension for his service in the Union Army. And those pension records hold a lot of information about African Americans during that time, how they had to, how they lived, how they had to prove who they were after the war was over, and so forth. And so the way that we know Abraham McGavick's story is through Tina Callahan Jones, a researcher in Williamson County, who did some research on USCT soldiers who came out of Williamson County. And that's how we know his story. And once it came out and was published, we're able to match his name with the name Abraham McGavick in the cemetery records. We had an Abraham McGavick, but we didn't know his story. Yeah. And Tina Callahan Jones did her research after there was a USCT soldier statue placed on the Franklin Square.
One last question for you, Betsy. You know, I understand that the city quit selling plots in the 1870s, so anybody that wants to be buried there now has to have a family plot, except if you're the mayor. All mayors and their significant others can be buried there. But what other notable people, notable Nashvillians are interred there at the cemetery?
I'm not the best person to ask about notables because my passion is finding the regular people. But I can tell you that there's 2 notable women that the Ella Shepherd Moore and another woman, Mabel Imes, I believe is her name. Am I saying that correctly? Were among the original Fisk Jubilee singers. They're buried there. Mm-hmm. They're quite notable. And then we have James Robertson, whose grave, he may have been the first person interred there because he was buried downtown in a cemetery, and they moved him there in July or January of 1822, and that's when it opened. So we don't know for sure that he was the first one. There's some governors. There's a lot of generals. Mm-hmm. And Polk was there for a short
Elias Polk.
Yeah. So
it's a very important
Sally
place.
Sally Thomas is probably one of the most well-known African Americans from the pre-Civil War time from Nashville. She's buried there.
All right. I want to thank both of you so much for being with us. My guests are members of the Nashville City Cemetery Association Board, Natalie Bell and Betsy Thorpe. Thank you both for being here with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, and thanks to you for tuning in this hour. This is Nashville is a production of Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced by Mary Mancini, directed by Tasha A. of Lemley. Our technical director and board operator is Liv Lombardi. The masterminds behind our theme music are Larange and Namir Blade. You can listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get good podcasts. And the conversation does not end here. Comment and tell us what you want to hear from the show by leaving us a message at 615-751-2500. You can find us on the socials, Blue Sky, Instagram, and X at This Is Nashville. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil A. Kulona. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody. And be good to each other.